Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at properties that a dog can have or that we can use in general in classes. And we're going to use the constructor here for. Now, the constructor is basically preceding the initializer, or it starts the initializer, but if there is no constructor, the initializer will still be executed. And we're going to set up our own constructor up here. Now we can use this keyword constructor, and then we can say what type of variables we want to have inside of our dog class. But we can also omit that if we don't want to specifically modify the visibility of those items inside of the constructor. Now that doesn't make sense for you to at the beginning. You won't understand what that means until quite a bit later in the course, which is not a problem because we can just go ahead and say that a dog should first of all have a name. So let's go ahead and create a name of type string for our dog. Now this is one way of doing it, but by doing so we are just creating a parameter that is never used. Well, what we can also do, we can use the val keyword here. Now this becomes a property. So what is the difference here? Because you see, like this way is just a parameter. The other moment it's a property. So if you hover over it, you can see that right here, it says parameter name is never used. But then if I add the val in here, suddenly it says property name is never used. So what the heck is going on here? Well, let's look at it by running a few examples. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that name and I'm going to pass the name to our barking dog. All right. So I'm going to just use that name to pass it in here. And then we're going to use name says woof woof. Now therefore we need to also say that this will be a string. Okay, so now we're basically saying when you create a dog object, please give me the name of the dog. Then I will run the function bark and will pass the name of the dog to that bark function, and then the dog will bark its name, or like the print statement will just say my name is, or name says woof woof. Okay, now the problem here is that our dog definition here doesn't fit anymore. So our dog needs to have a name. So I'm going to say that this is going to be Daisy. Okay, so now let's run the basics KT, and it says Daisy says woof woof. So now we have basically treated our class similar to a function that then calls another function that calls another function. So that's like, what is going on? Why is that necessary? Well, the thing is, it's not really necessary because it's just an example of what you can do. You can pass parameters to classes, but what makes a lot more sense is to actually make this a property. So now what does that mean? Well, the property now means that this is actually a part of that object. Okay, before, when it was just a parameter, it was just information that was passed to that object. And let's say, as if we said something to that dog, that doesn't make the dog be that thing that we say to the dog. But if we give it a name, then suddenly it becomes part of that dog. So the dog has suddenly a name that is a characteristic of that dog. So a dog has a name, okay? But then what else could a dog have? Well, a dog could have a breed, okay? So this will also be of type string. Now we also need to add the val here because I want to make sure that the breed is actually part of that dog, a part of the characteristics of that dog, which means it's a property inside of the dog. So now the dog identifies itself as whatever breed it is. So now when we go ahead and go back to our basics KT, we see that now just passing the name is not enough anymore. We also need to pass the breed. And as I said, it was like a dwarf, poodle, yeah, something like that, probably like separately written. So it was a dwarf poodle. At least that's the breed of the dog that I own. So let's go back to our run. Let's rerun it, and nothing changes, right? It still says Daisy says woof woof. But now, the difference now is that we can actually access our dog's properties. So we now know that Daisy, this dog, this object of our dog, so Daisy is just an object now, we can now access properties of our Daisy. So we can say Daisy dot, and you can see that suddenly breed and name have appeared, as well as bark has appeared. So now instead of just barking when the dog is created, we can now bark at any time. But that's not what I want to do at this point. I want to get the breed. So Daisy, or like, let's say we go further, we say Daisy dot name is a, and here again, Daisy breed. So you see, if you want to do string manipulation here with variables or like properties of classes, you need to actually add the curly brackets as well, because otherwise it wouldn't know when the name of that variable is ending. But with the curly brackets, you really make sure that it does understand what it's supposed to print out. So now it says print Daisy name is a Daisy breed. Okay, so let's run this again. And we will see, it says, first of all, the woof woof is still executed. So our dog is still being created, right? But then Daisy is a dwarf poodle. So now we have gotten the properties, the characteristics of that object, Daisy, because they were created in the first place. So here is where they were created. This is where we assigned properties to that class, and now we can use them. So in other programming languages, this would be a two-step process where you would go ahead and pass data really as a parameter, and then you would create properties directly in here. So you would create a name in here, and that would be the name, for example. But luckily, Kotlin is a lot smarter and just does that directly in this one line. Okay, so we don't need to do anything around it. Now, if I were to only use this as parameters, as we've seen earlier, now breed is a parameter. It's not a property anymore. Now this suddenly doesn't work anymore. Okay, you cannot access parameters that were passed. You can access, however, properties that have been passed. So you see, it doesn't know what daisy.name is because daisy.name doesn't exist. So this line that we had here, this line here, it defines that every single dog will automatically have a property of type string called name and the property of type string called breed. So if you now look at the text that we have in the documentation, a few things will make a lot more sense, right? So now you understand what this parameter stuff means. And then well, it uses the keyword primary constructor. It's just that you can have a primary constructor and a secondary constructor, but we're going to look at that in a bit. So the key that you have to understand here is that Kotlin has a concise syntax for declaring properties and initializing them from the primary constructor, which we just did, right? We used val, we used the name, and then the type of the property. Now, one last thing, and that's something that is here. So such declarations can also include default values of the class property. All right, let me show you what that means. So you can fixate that whenever an object of a certain class is created, that a certain value or multiple values, depending on what you want, have a default value. So even if you don't specifically give that value or override that value, it will still exist. So how can we do that? Well, let's actually add another one, and I'm going to create a var age, and this one will be an int. Okay, so now I'm going to set that to 0. So I say equals 0. What that does is it says that by default the age will be 0. So whenever I create a new dog, the dog will be newly born and it will be at 0. So now if we create Daisy, Daisy doesn't have an age, and we can now add the age, and is $daisy.age years old. Okay, so if we run this now, it will say 0 years old. So Daisy is a dwarf poodle and is 0 years old, because we never actually defined that value, but by adding it here as a default, we say that Daisy is 0. Now, if we want to override that, what we can do is we can actually add a value here. So let's say Daisy is 1 year old. Well, we can add the age here, and then we can run again, and it will say the dwarf poodle is 1 year old. Okay, so that's basically the default values that you can assign to a property, but you can also do that with functions, and we will see that at time being. So that is pretty much it for this video. In the next one, we're going to keep going with the constructors and so forth. So see you there.